Hello, CHistrue here, and I want to say a few words about the historical legacy of Thomas Jefferson. It's a complex legacy because we do have the legacy of someone who was a slaveholder. We do have the legacy of somebody who wrote very disparaging things about African Americans. We have a legacy of somebody who did conspire to move Native Americans off of their land. And I think that if we were to engage in a simplistic understanding of history where this person's good and this person's bad, I can understand the conclusions that a lot of people come to when addressing the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. But I also think a few things need to be kept in consideration. I'm not saying that African American and progressive historians shouldn't criticize the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. There should be. But a few things need to be kept in mind. For one thing, traditionally, it was people on the right who tended to attack the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. After all, he was, in their minds, anti-religion, and in their minds, in the minds of conservatives of his time, he was a dangerous social radical who was in favor of the French Revolution. And it appears as though he was a dangerous social radical who, from their standpoint, dangerous, quote-unquote, which, if you think about it, meant that his influence was one that influenced movements for greater equality. Now, the French Revolution obviously had a dark side, the terror, just like Thomas Jefferson had a dark side, his racial views. But remember that the quote-unquote light side and the quote-unquote dark side are really both part of a broader social movement of his time called the Enlightenment. You can't make quick and easy distinctions. The Enlightenment was a complex social phenomenon. On the one hand, it gave birth to modern notions of equality under law. On the other hand, it undercut those very notions with a kind of racial anthropological view of humanity. These were inconsistent. And ultimately, in Western thought, it's a good thing that the better side of it won out. The darker side of it led to a very bitter fruit. Within Thomas Jefferson was both impulses. But again, we have to remember that any kind of a judgment, morally or philosophically, has to consider the consequences of that judgment. If you are to completely, not just criticize the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, which should be criticized, but if you're to completely abolish it or to obliterate it, that would have consequences. And the consequence would be there'd be no greater impetus towards equality. No worker movement, no feminist movement, no abolitionist movement, no anti-colonial movement. None of these things would or could exist without the idea of equality. And that idea of equality was the greater movement of which Jefferson himself was a part, along with Paine, along with Franklin. Again, criticize the three of them as you will. Definitely, in the case of the American Revolution, there were definite limits put on how far the revolution would go by the men of property who put the reins on the idea of equality. But that idea of equality was there. And in the case of Thomas Jefferson, he often went further than what those limits would allow. He had very progressive views on well, let's say, limited by race and gender. But within those limits, he did hold very progressive views on property, on redistribution, on freedom of religion, a lot of things. Now, when you go outside of those limits, yes, you definitely do have to criticize the racial and other limits that he put on those ideas. But if you were to completely overthrow the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, you in a sense would have no intellectual mechanism by which to criticize those limits. Not only that, but you would have no SDS, no Black Panthers, no... today we have the Occupy movement. We also have the movement to overthrow the prison industrial complex. Now, the prison industrial complex is the slavery issue of today. In Jefferson's time, if you criticize it, well, maybe a little later than Jefferson, because he did criticize slavery. I mean, he was, during his time, you could be anti-slavery. In the decades after his time, you could not be. The slave power had a total lock on Congress and a lock on the presidency and a lock on the courts. Well, today, the prison industrial complex has a lock on Congress and a lock on the presidency and a lock on the courts. So are the very people who are very progressive on yesterday's social issue, are they progressive on today's social issue? Right now, right here. The mass incarceration of people. Racial disparity in sentencing. But also the curtailment, in a sense, the imprisonment of the entire country. We have the drones flying overhead now. That's kind of an imprisonment of the entire country under law enforcement. In those days, you couldn't speak out against slavery because the slave power really was going to move against you. And even Jefferson himself, you might say that his opposition to slavery was limited and timid, and he vacillated partly because of his racial views, but it was present in his thinking. But part of the reason it didn't come out more was because the slave power itself was a kind of an octopus that had a stranglehold. Well, today, the prison guards unions, the police unions, the correctional corporations, the bankers, they operate the very same way. If you criticize them, you don't get elected to Congress. You don't get elected to the presidency. You don't get a court appointment. Are these very historians going to be severely critical of that? And if they are, what language will they use against it but the language of equality itself? And that language does date back to the Declaration. What's confusing is that again, as I think I stated before, the men of property and the people in charge of the country during the time of 1787 put definite limits on how far that democracy would extend. But it doesn't mean the idea wasn't there. Thomas Jefferson put definite limits on himself, because there was an element of his thinking that did not only want to abolish slavery, but that even began to transcend the whole idea of race and racial limits. But then he would snap back. Are we snapping back today? Are we repeating the very same hypocrisy that we would criticize by claiming that we're for these high-sounding causes, but when it actually comes time to oppose the mass incarceration, we don't do it? Think about that. History is A, written by the victors, but B, it's refined by the moralists. The victor part we can't help, but the ultra-moralists, I think we can. You have to view history as an interlocking of different movements, of different social movements. Because if you try to view it simplistically, you're going to miss the forest for the trees. So again, I say 3 cheers for the Thomas Jefferson of all men are created equal. For that Thomas Jefferson, 3 cheers. And for the other Thomas Jefferson, well, I do think he should be severely criticized. I do agree. And he held 2 contradictory selves. But do we today? That's my question for you.